This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person, one vote, or one moment you missed. This is about something heavier, slower, almost invisible until it's too late. What's breaking isn't loud. It doesn't trend. It settles quietly deep inside the system that everything else sits on. For years, you were told there was a safe place, a neutral place, a place that didn't take sides. That assumption is failing, not because of panic, not because of collapse, but because a line was crossed. And once crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. Most people are watching the surface. They always do. But the real movement is underneath, where exits take months, not minutes. If you want to understand what comes next, you have to follow what's leaving, not what's being announced. Stay with me, because the most important signal in this story was designed not to be noticed. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. For decades, you were told this system was governed by markets, by price signals, by rational buyers making rational decisions. That is no longer true. What controls the system now is not confidence, it's alignment. The most important asset in the global economy is no longer priced by risk and return. It's priced by loyalty. Who is aligned? Who is protected? Who can be frozen with a keystroke? This is the quiet shift. Power moving away from balance sheets and into jurisdictions. Away from yield and into permission. In that world, safety is no longer about creditworthiness. It's about political distance. Assets don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they're reachable. And when an asset becomes reachable, it stops being neutral. It stops being a foundation. It becomes leverage. This is why the story isn't about one country buying or selling. It's about what happens when the system's anchor stops behaving like an anchor. Because once the anchor moves, everything tied to it starts to drift. And that drift has already begun. The most dangerous changes are the ones that feel normal while they're happening. Nothing snapped. Nothing broke overnight. There was no announcement. There was just less. Before, this system worked because it didn't have to think. Surpluses flowed back automatically. Trade turned into debt. Debt turned into stability. It was boring. And boring systems tend to last. Now compare that to what exists today. The same instruments are still there. The same language. The same rituals. But the behavior underneath has changed. Positions that were meant to be permanent are being treated as temporary. Holdings that once signaled trust are now treated like exposure. This didn't start last week or last year. It crept in slowly, normalized by headlines, buried in footnotes. And that's the danger, because when a slow exit becomes routine, it stops looking like a warning. It starts looking like background noise. But background noise, over time, reshapes the entire structure. And once enough weight leaves quietly, the system doesn't collapse. It rebalances itself in ways you don't control. And that's where the real pressure begins. Then the numbers finally moved in a way that was impossible to ignore. Not a rumor, not an estimate, a line item, buried in a government report that almost no one reads. A position that had taken more than a decade to build was suddenly smaller, much smaller. This wasn't trimming around the edges. This wasn't routine management. This was scale. Hundreds of billions reduced to a figure that erased 16 years of accumulation. A level not seen since a very different world. And the timing mattered. These sales didn't happen when prices were high. They happened when prices were already down. When anyone focused on returns would have waited. In finance, that's the tell. You don't lock in losses unless something else matters more than money. Liquidity pressure can do that. But this wasn't liquidity. This was choice, which means the sale itself isn't the story. It's the reason someone was willing to pay that price to get out. And once you understand that reason, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who was forced to step in? To understand what happened next, you have to look past the headline sellers. Markets don't care who is leaving. They care who replaces them. When a buyer that large steps away, there are only two possibilities. Either prices adjust or someone absorbs the shock. Prices, for the moment, didn't collapse, which tells you everything. The demand didn't disappear. It changed character. This is where the mechanism reveals itself. The buyers who stepped in weren't chasing return. They were preventing failure. These weren't economic traits. They were stabilizing operations. Balance sheets were stretched, not because the trade was attractive, but because the alternative was worse. And that's the shift. When support becomes mandatory, risk doesn't vanish. It migrates, it moves outward, from the center of the system to the edges that can least afford it. This is how fragility is disguised as coordination, how intervention pretends to be confidence. And once a system starts relying on obligation instead of appetite, it becomes sensitive to one thing above all else: capacity. Because no alliance, no matter how disciplined, can absorb infinite strain, and that limit is closer than it looks. Now the pace quickens, because strain never stays abstract. As one balance sheet fills, another empties. As one market stabilizes, another tightens. Support begins to cost. Small cracks appear, then stress tests fail. Liquidity that should have gone to growth is redirected to defense. Not defense of borders, defense of prices. This is what escalation looks like in a financial system. Lucidez, no emergency meetings you can watch, just pressure transferring. And it transfers fast because political buyers don't behave like investors. They don't average in patiently. They hold until they can't. Currencies wobble. Domestic markets feel it first. And when those pressures collide with voters, with pensions, with housing, the math changes. The trade that was necessary becomes impossible. That's the moment everyone fears, the moment the support line hesitates. Because if one pillar steps back to save itself, the weight doesn't disappear. It drops, and systems don't absorb drops. They fracture. This is where it reaches you. Not as a headline, not as a chart, as a feeling. Things cost more, even when nothing went wrong. Credit feels tighter. Decisions you didn't make start shaping your options. You're told this is temporary. That stability is being protected. But protection has a price, and you're already paying it. Because when support is political, the cost is social. Resources that once built resilience are diverted to maintain appearance. Risk is socialized quietly, slowly. And you feel it as uncertainty, plans get shorter. Margins thinner. Security feels conditional. This is the human layer of a system under strain. And here's the part no one says out loud. The system only works as long as you believe it does. Stay with me. Because what's happening next isn't about stress, it's about redirection. And the direction it's moving in changes the meaning of safe. Once this kind of pressure builds, it doesn't stay contained. Capital moves. So does risk. What was once a domestic adjustment becomes an international reaction. One balance sheet tightens and another feels the echo. Trade routes shift, stockpiles grow, insurance becomes strategy. This is how a financial decision turns geopolitical without ever announcing itself. Because when trust between systems weakens, everyone prepares separately, quietly, defensively. What used to be shared infrastructure starts to fragment, not into chaos, but into blocks. And blocks don't optimize for efficiency. They optimize for survival. That's when redundancy replaces cooperation. When just in time becomes just in case, and the costs compound, more capital locked away, more resources pulled offline, more friction everywhere. At first, it looks like resilience. Then it starts to feel like hoarding. And the moment you realize this isn't local anymore, that the system itself is rearranging, you also realize something else. There may not be a way back to how this worked before. From here, the system has only 3 paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment, controlled, managed, pain spread thin over time. Yields rise just enough. Support continues, carefully rationed. The system bends and pretends this is normal. The second is erosion. Slower, more dangerous. Support weakens quietly as capacity drains. Confidence doesn't collapse, it leaks. Every intervention buys less stability than the last, and then there's rupture. Not a single event, a sequence. One buyer steps back to protect itself. Another hesitates. Markets move faster than coordination can follow. At that point, the system is no longer being priced. It's being tested. Emergency tools come out. Rules change midstream. Stability is enforced, not earned. Which path we take depends on timing, on tolerance, on how much strain political buyers can absorb before their own systems demand relief. And that's the unresolved question, because the system can survive stress. What it cannot survive is a sudden loss of belief. There's no clean ending to this. No moment where someone steps up and restores the old rules, because the old rules depended on something that no longer exists. Distance. When assets could be held far away from power, when safety was assumed, not negotiated. That world is gone. What replaced it isn't collapse, it's exposure. Every position now carries a second question. Not what does it pay, but who can touch it? And that question doesn't stay theoretical for long. You don't have to panic, but you do have to pay attention, because systems don't announce their breaking points. They reveal them only after enough people stop believing the structure will hold. This story isn't finished. It's accelerating. And the next phase won't begin with a crisis. It will begin with a decision that looks reasonable at the time. If you want to understand that moment when it arrives and why it won't look dramatic until it's irreversible, stay with this. Because once the foundation becomes conditional, everything built on top of it becomes a choice. And not everyone will be allowed to choose.